Hey, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the brand new Vinyl Me Please monthly edition, and that is actually a Blue Note album. It is seldom that VMP, Vinyl Me Please, puts out Blue Note albums, but they've done it in the past. They've put out Freedom Rider, right, by Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. They put out a Donald Byrd title in the past, so it's not without precedent, but it is always exciting when they choose to put out a Blue Note record, because For those of us who don't know anything about anything, which is most of us, right? We think, how did Vinyl Me Please get exclusivity to a Blue Note record? It's kind of exciting, but it also begs the question, why not Tone Poet? Why not the Blue Note Classic series, right? Why not some of these other avenues? I think that some people get concerned because there's this perceived exclusivity with Vinyl Me Please putting some of this stuff out. But keep in mind that you don't need, I think for a lot of titles, you don't need a subscription in order to get them. I just think you have to pay a couple more dollars. But it's important to know that if you are going to do that, whether you get a subscription or pay a few more dollars, that you know what you're getting and that you know that it's going to be quality. And so therefore, hopefully this video is helpful for someone. So what this title looks like is right here. This is Brown Sugar by Freddie Roach. So Freddie Roach is a little bit of a, I would say, less respected Blue Note leader, and I think it's for a couple of reasons. Number one is he is an organ player, and organ players for Blue Note do not get as much respect as, say, other leaders. And I think part of the reason is because of Jimmy Smith. Now, Jimmy Smith was a very different organ player. He not only was, I believe, the most prolific leader for Blue Note. I'm trying to think if Horace Silver, by the end of his career, had more albums for Blue Note, because, right, Horace Silver continued into, like the late 70s for Blue Note, whereas Jimmy Smith was out, moving over to Verve by, 66 or 67, something like that, maybe even earlier. But in any event, Jimmy Smith was one of those leaders who really monopolized his time in the studio. Everything seemed to be about Jimmy Smith, even when he had Stanley Turrentine, Kenny Burrell, and others joining him on some of these dates. They just became Jimmy Smith shows, and it was about the sort of acrobatics of the organ. Let me show you everything that it can do with all the effects. And it's a lot. It's a lot of like church sounding music. It's and it's just, it can be abrasive, or at least I think it's abrasive. All right, there are some Jimmy Smith albums that I really like, but I don't love all of them. So Freddie Roach suffers a little bit from that, and the other reason why perhaps people are a little bit skeptical when they see his name is because of an album called All That's Good. All That's Good was a vocal heavy album that I would say, at least in some of the, some of the folks that I talk to believe that this is one of the weakest albums that Blue Note ever put out. All That's Good. It might be. Alongside some of those Jimmy Smith titles. But that shouldn't make you come to the conclusion that Brown Sugar is less than an outstanding album. It's really, really good. And so I was excited when Vinyl Me Please was going to put this out. I was excited that it's an all analog pressing. It is cut by Ryan Smith at Sterling Sound, 180 gram tip-on jacket. There's a lot to love about it. Now, I know that some people are skeptical of what is the pressing plant. It's called like GZ, maybe GZ Media or something like that, that presses this. Let's be real. They are involved here, and I know others have told me they've had quality issues with this particular plant. I've not personally experienced those quality issues, but I'm not, I believe that they are there. But simply, Vinyl Me Please is still standing up their own pressing plant, and it hasn't come online yet. And so here we are, and we have this fantastic Blue Note title. And guess what? I didn't have any issues with this pressing, and I think it sounds really, really good. Every bit as good as if. Here's the thing. It doesn't sound like a Tone Poet. It doesn't have that kind of flashiness about some of the sonic detail, but it is really good. It's better than the classic series that Blue Note's putting out, that's for sure. So anyway, let's talk a little bit more about this album. All right, so just a little bit of explanation in terms of what this album is about. I am going to do a little bit of a comparison with the original pressing, but I not necessarily have that be the highlight here. But for those who are interested in whether this is a worthwhile pressing and how it compares to the original, happy to provide some of that feedback. So here, I'm gonna lose this this obi for now. All right, so let me start out. This is from 1964. And one of the highlights of this album, and I always hesitate to say to like highlight some of the sidemen when you consider, it's really about the leader and it's kind of about their vision, I would say. But alongside Freddie Roach, you do have Joe Henderson. And if you're like me, anything Joe Henderson, right? There's few musicians who I will say anything and then their name, and Joe Henderson's one, Bobby Hutcherson, Lee Morgan, etc., right? And so the fact that Joe Henderson is on this album, I would say despite the fact that it is a soul-forward Blue Note outing, hesitate to say that because Joe Henderson was very versatile. He didn't just choose specific types of music to play. In fact, he was doing like really non-jazz stuff. I think there's an album called like Accio, maybe for Muse, that he did sort of late in his career that's really good and it's a little bit out of character, I would say. But you can find Joe Henderson on a variety of different styles of music and not just hard bop, right? So anyway, he's on here. You've got Eddie Wright on guitar and you have Clarence Johnston on drums. We don't need piano, we don't need bass because Freddie Roach covers those with the organ, and he actually does it really, really well. So anyway, that's a little bit of the lay of the land with this particular lineup. Like I said, there is a sort of soul jazz forward sound here and there on this album, although I don't think it's fair to classify it as just that. Mostly because some of that style can be construed as being overly sort of pop-y or more just like toe tapping and predictable. And I don't think that that's the case, both in part due to Joe Henderson playing on this album, as well as honestly, Freddie Roach. He didn't play like other organists in terms of trying to fill every available space with some type of sound, some sort of like sustaining note. He didn't do that. He played with a little bit more space, and he also gave his group members space as well on his albums. And I think that makes it seem like a more well-rounded album. So with this pressing, you do get the obi, and you also get Vinyl Me Please always does this. I think they have these little booklets. Maybe actually, you know what? I think they do it just for their monthly releases, not necessarily for everything. So anyway, you do have this little booklet with it was written by Ashwanta Jackson, and she talks a little bit about the history of the organ and its sort of relevance in this music and with this style. And I actually I find these little booklets are actually very, very interesting as companions to, what's typically vintage liner notes, right? Liner notes that were written like 50 years ago. So I kind of like this type of stuff because it's a little bit more of a retrospective. Something that I think introduces this album better than I could in words is actually some of the liner notes. And I'm going to read you just a couple of sentences because, interestingly enough, Freddie Roach actually wrote his own liner notes. That's somewhat unusual. You don't really see that too often. You see that with like John Coltrane's "A Love Supreme," right, where I think he wrote his own liner notes, but you don't see it that often. And so, anyway, what it says at the very beginning of these liner notes, I think, sets the mood really well, at least for some of this album. So what he says is, and this wasn't meant to be like a story. This is just him, kind of explaining his motivation, I think, with this album and what the recording day was like. So he says, "It was raining as we arrived at the recording studio. A soft, warm rain. Not enough to really bother anyone. Just enough to make the earth a darker brown and polish the streets in a high gloss. The sounds of the nearby highway mixed with a steady dripping from the roof of the studio on a garbage can lid below, providing a sort of natural set of drums. I stood in the rain listening." So I find that to be very sort of atmospheric. It kind of paints a picture, I think, of the vibe of this album. This is late night spinning kind of stuff. It's relaxing, even with the up-tempo stuff. It's not exactly a dance record. Some people describe certain types of soul jazz anyway as like, wanting you to making you get off your feet. This one, at least for me, not so much. It's a little bit more subdued, even the up-tempo stuff. But I do think that the best track on this album, as well as the best track that matches some of that style that Freddie Roach introduces, is the track "The Midnight Sun Will Never Set." And it's not an original, but it opens side 2. And I just find that track, if you're going to start anywhere, if you're going to like preview this album and find out whether it's something that you're interested in, I would start there because, again, it's called The Midnight Sun Will Never Set. It is just absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous track. All right, so I'm trying to think if there's anything else I need to say before maybe I get into a little bit of that sonic comparison, and then I'll close things out. I mean, you know, obviously this is 64, right? So you've got Rudy Van Gelder behind the recording. This is a Reed Miles cover. I'm trying to remember the name of the model. Oh, actually, it's written on the back here, Clara Lewis Buggs. Really, really nice photo, I think, as well. So what I'm going to be doing for this comparison, so this Vinyl Me Please edition is a stereo edition. I'm going to be comparing it to an original mono, and I know that that's not exactly fair. I also know that there's a lot of folks who really, really like the mono presentation of this album. That's a little bit unusual for me, honestly, because most of the, especially mid-60s, early to mid-60s stuff, if I was to even put a finer point on it, maybe like 1962 and forward, I really like stereo for Blue Note. However, with this being an organ-led album, there's a little bit of a different element here because the organ does kind of play multiple instruments, at least in terms of what it's representing. And so I suppose I could see the benefit of the mono presentation, but let's I'll as I sort of talk about some of the sonic differences, I'll try to lean into that topic a little bit as well. All right, so I mentioned that my favorite track is the opening on side 2, and that's called The Midnight Sun Will Never Set. And so let me just kind of orient you on this VMP reissue and talk to you a little bit about what I hear. So first of all, if you go and preview this track, this is one of those that it doesn't even start out actually with organ, and it is probably one of the quietest organ sort of led tracks that you'll ever hear. It's very, very sort of soft and moody, and there's not the organ just doesn't really dominate. And I think that it's really interesting to hear that instrument in such an understated setting. So the track opens with guitar and tenor, and it's slow and it's plodding, almost like with each beat it's getting like it's slowing even further down because it's like swinging, and it's just really, really slow tempo. And it makes you kind of want to sink into your couch and just kind of like relax. And so that's sort of the vibe that it sets. From a format perspective in the stereo presentation, we do have guitar and tenor in the left channel. We have drums in the right, and then we have Freddie Roach right in the center, I'm pretty sure, like dead center. And with the stereo presentation, I actually really, really enjoy it, especially compared to the mono. And the reason why, I think there's benefits on actually for each of them, but the benefits on the stereo side is that you get more detail around Joe Henderson's tenor. And the reason why is because with these separated channels, in order to hear some of these instruments, you're able to focus a little bit more on the tenor as opposed to having him be stacked on top of everybody else. And so it feels like you're getting more of the airiness, or at least detail around the airiness of his playing. In fact, his very first note is like, gosh, there's like a full even half second of just air before you hear the actual tone come out. And so it's very, very soft. And it's nice to hear some of that detail that is accentuated by the stereo soundstage, by the clear separation. And, it's not hard panned, right? But you have more separation between the two. And then you also hear the drums a little bit better as well because they're in the right channel. And in fact, they're the only instrument that is sort of solely in the right channel, right? Because you have the organ that's kind of in the center, and so it feels like you get a little bit more space around the drums too, and you get to hear them a little bit better. And so I really like stereo format for these mid-60s sessions because I like hearing each of the instruments. So that's what I like about that track as far as the VMP. Now for the original in this mono format, so obviously you have the same sound coming out of each channel. What you do get, I think for the most part I prefer the VMP. For this track, what you do get though is a fatter sound in Joe Henderson's tenor, and it hits you like a wall, right? In fact, all the instruments do. But I would say especially organ and tenor, and you get more of a sense of blend between those two instruments than you do in the stereo separation. And again, the sound just like hits you like a wall. It just feels very like full and like it's filling the space. It's fatter tones or something. I don't even know if I'm using words that like, you know, are relevant to others until you hear it, and then maybe you'll understand what I'm talking about. But I do really like that about the mono presentation. And it's not as robust. That sound is not as in your face and robust with the stereo. It's a little bit more delicate. It's a little bit more nuanced with the stereo. But it's not a bad thing. Like I said, the stereo sounds really, really great, and I think that each format has its own merits. So there's one other track that I want to talk about just as a point of comparison because it's very different stylistically. It's also the only track on this album that Freddie Roach composed himself, and that is the title track, so Brown Sugar. So opens side one, and this is a pretty sort of fast-paced song, especially compared to the opening track of side two. It's probably, you know, I'm trying to think, I don't have a really good internal metronome, but it's probably, I don't know, like 140 beats, you know, per minute or something like that. So it's relatively fast-paced, and it's an exciting track. And what sticks out in my head in this particular track with the fast pace is that again, it's the same format. You got the drums in the right channel. You got Joe Henderson in the left, and he takes the first solo after the melody is established. And it is a little bit interesting, I suppose, to hear Joe Henderson's tenor only coming out of the left channel. And for some reason, in this track, it's more prominent, or it's more apparent to me that it resides only over there and not anywhere else, and so your head is almost like wanting to turn to the left channel, almost to pay attention to him. Now there are some benefits that you get with that in terms of detail. I noticed that he plays some notes here, whereas so he plays a note and then it'll like fall off. He'll sort of trail down. I forget what they call it. I should know these things. I used to play, but he'll play a note and then he'll kind of like flutter down through some other notes. So it'll go like bow, right? So he'll play a note and then he like, you know, kind of plays notes trailing off. And I didn't notice that when I was listening to the mono, and so some of the benefit of having tenor just in one channel and not necessarily all the instruments there with him is that you get to focus a little bit more on some of that detail. You get to pay a little bit closer attention. And I would say that as well that the drums have a little bit more detail being in the right channel, that you can hear a little bit more of the crispness of them compared to the mono. So those are some of the benefits that you get from the VMP Stereo Edition. Now, what you get from the mono in this track, I think is this one swings a little bit more in the mono's favor. That tenor solo just comes across as more exciting in the mono presentation. And I don't know if it's because it's apparent that it has to sort of shine above the organ and the rest of the instruments, but it just seems brighter and, like I said earlier, kind of more in your face. And it works really, really well for these fast-paced tracks, and maybe not quite as well for some of the slower, more moodier pieces. And so I think that's why the mono here, I think, wins for me in terms of that track, that fast-paced track, whereas the Midnight Sun Will Never Set, I think might swing in VMP's favor. So, you know, what does this mean? I mean, I'm comparing a mono and a stereo, and the mono's vintage and the stereo's modern. I mean, you know, what are we supposed to do here? It's not apples to apples. These are different presentations. But I think I am in a position to tell you whether I think the VMP is worth picking up and whether it's a solid release, and I definitely think that it is. It's helpful for me because my mono, even though it's original, is not in the best shape. I say that about a lot of things. Here's the thing, is that anytime that you listen to a modern reissue and you get to experience what a noise-less pressing sounds like, it just makes you feel a little bit like why am I buying these vintage pressings that have any issues whatsoever? And I'm not the sort of person that obviously I'd love to have a near mint copy of everything, but I buy original pressings that are not near mint. I try not to buy VG and below, but every now and then I do. And I would say that my copy of this is in the VG to VG plus range. And so, it's really exciting for me to be able to hear such a great sounding modern pressing that doesn't have any of those any of that disruption, any of the crackle or anything. And so, I think that Vinyl Me Please did a really nice job with this album. I didn't have any flaws in my copy. I haven't heard necessarily chatter of others finding flaws in theirs either, in terms of there being, what do people call like non-fill or or dropouts and stuff like that. I didn't have any of those issues with this, and nor do we typically with Ryan Smith's mastering efforts, provided that the master tapes are still in decent shape, right? Because sometimes we're at the mercy of that. But I think that if you're the sort of person who likes Blue Note and you like, even Tone Poets, although again, this is not a Tone Poet pressing. This is more a representation, I think, of what the original stereo pressing likely sounds like. But giving you the opportunity to have a very clean pressing, and perhaps a little bit more detail because of some of probably the higher quality pressing processes, generally speaking, that at least are potentially out there these days. And I think that they really did a good job. The jacket is a great construction. Again, it's a helpful little booklet. I'm a member of VMP anyway, and so I'm getting, I'm going to get this, or I got this, and I'm going to get the Monk that's coming out very soon, right? I'm really excited about that. So I think they have a nice little string of pressings right now. I'm really excited for the mastering plant, the pressing plant that they have coming online, I think later this summer. And maybe that maybe that will only improve things. But I don't think that there's, like I said, I don't think there's any evidence of this one. This release being anything other than stellar. It's in that stereo presentation. And so, if you're the sort of person who, if you want to wait for a mono, you might be waiting a long time, or you're going to have to go for an original. And so I personally think that there's a lot to love about the stereo. I think it suits the mood really, really well. And I've been really enjoying this, spinning it over the last week, probably more than I've ever spun my original. So that's got to say something. So if you've stuck with me to the end here, maybe hit subscribe. That'd be nice. You can follow me on Instagram at what_can_brown. I think I already posted a little bit of like an abbreviated version of this review the other day, so you can go check that out. And I guess I will see you next time.